Thanks for stopping by. When our channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, we're launching a lottery giveaway, and one new subscriber will win an iPhone 17 Pro Max. Subscribe now and be in the race before it's too late. We didn't buy the lake house because we were afraid of people. We bought it because we were tired of being surrounded by noise that never stopped asking something from us. Phones buzzed, streets argued, calendars filled themselves. Every day felt borrowed from the next. The listing showed a narrow dock, a quiet shoreline, and water that reflected trees instead of traffic lights. That felt like relief, not escape. The house itself was modest. 1 floor, 2 bedrooms, a wood stove that smelled faintly of iron and smoke even when it wasn't burning. The realtor talked about resale value and seasonal demand, but none of that registered. I noticed the way the wind moved across the lake without interruption. I noticed how voices carried and then disappeared. That absence felt intentional, like the land was offering space instead of taking it. We told friends it was for weekends, a place to reset. Nobody questioned it because everyone understood burnout, even if they pretended not to have it themselves. Work had flattened us into routines that left no room for quiet thought. Even conversations felt scheduled. The lake house promised unscheduled time, and that felt rare enough to chase. There were practical reasons too, though we didn't lead with those. The road in was long and poorly maintained. Cell service dropped 5 miles out. Snow lingered late into spring. Those were framed as inconveniences, but privately I liked them. Distance made things feel deliberate. If someone showed up, it would be because they meant to. The first night we stayed there, the silence was uncomfortable. I kept waiting for something to interrupt it. An engine, a neighbor, sirens far away. None came. The only sound was water tapping against the dock in irregular patterns. I remember realizing how much of my attention had been trained to expect interruption, and how slowly it relaxed once nothing arrived. We didn't talk much that night. Not because there was tension, but because words felt unnecessary. We cooked, ate, and sat near the window watching the dark settle across the lake. It felt like being inside a held breath, the kind that isn't panic, just pause. Looking back, that pause is what I wanted more than anything. A place where nothing demanded reaction. A place where time stretched instead of compressed. The lake house felt like an answer to a question we hadn't learned how to ask out loud yet. At the time, I believed isolation was neutral, that it simply removed variables. I didn't think of it as protection or vulnerability. It was just distance, and distance felt clean. The idea that distance could harden into a boundary never crossed my mind. We weren't planning for endings. We were planning for quiet. I remember thinking the house didn't feel owned so much as borrowed, like we were allowed to exist there as long as we respected its pace. Mornings arrived without alarms. Coffee tasted different when nothing rushed it. Even small tasks slowed down, carrying firewood, checking the weather by looking at the sky instead of an app. These were not romantic gestures. They were adjustments, subtle ones that changed how the day unfolded. The lake reflected back whatever you brought to it. If you arrived tense, the stillness amplified that. If you arrived tired, it gave rest without commentary. I started sleeping deeper. Dreams stretched instead of snapping me awake. It felt like recovery, the kind people promise themselves they'll get to later. We told ourselves the world would keep spinning without us for a few days at a time, that emails could wait, that emergencies belonged to other places. The lake house allowed that illusion. It let us believe separation was temporary and voluntary, that we could step back in whenever we chose. I didn't consider what would happen if the choice was removed. The idea never presented itself as a possibility. Distance felt like control, not risk. The road out was always there. The map was clear. At least, that's what I thought then. I trusted that assumption without testing it, because nothing in my life had forced me to before. The days settled into patterns that didn't announce themselves. Morning arrived as light sliding across the water, not as an alert or obligation. I woke when my body decided it was finished resting. The house creaked as it adjusted to temperature changes, small sounds that felt conversational rather than intrusive. Nothing competed for attention. That absence took time to understand. We learned the property by walking it. The shoreline curved more than it looked on maps. Rocks hid just below the surface near the eastern edge, shaping how the water moved when the wind shifted. Loons crossed the lake at irregular hours, their calls stretching farther than I expected. I stopped thinking of silence as empty. It was layered, occupied by details I had ignored for years. Inside, routines simplified. Meals became quieter events. Dishes were washed immediately because there was no reason to delay them. The radio stayed off. When we spoke, it was usually about what we were doing in that moment. Planning ahead felt unnecessary. The future seemed patient enough to wait. Connectivity faded without ceremony. Messages loaded slowly, then not at all. At first, it felt like a minor inconvenience, the kind you joke about. I told myself it was good to be unreachable. That was the point, after all. We had chosen remoteness. The difference between choosing it and depending on it hadn't occurred to me yet. Weather dictated more than I expected. Clouds gathered without warning. Rain arrived heavy and brief, then vanished. The water responded instantly, changing texture and color. I began checking the sky out of habit. It felt grounding to rely on observation instead of updates. I didn't realize how quickly that habit would harden into necessity. Evenings were the clearest marker of change. Darkness came faster out there. Without surrounding lights, night felt deliberate. We closed curtains not for privacy, but to keep warmth in. The world narrowed to the space we occupied. Candles replaced overhead lights. Shadows moved differently along the walls, softer and less defined. I noticed how distance altered my sense of scale. Problems that felt urgent in town lost their weight. Time expanded around simple actions, carrying water from the pump, splitting kindling, locking the door before bed even though no one else was around. These habits formed quietly, without discussion. There were moments of unease, though I didn't label them that way then. A boat engine echoing far off with no clear source. A light across the water one night that disappeared before I could point it out. I dismissed those details easily. The mind looks for explanations that preserve comfort. What stayed with me most was how quickly quiet stopped feeling strange. It became the baseline. Noise, when it appeared, felt out of place. I didn't miss the constant input. I didn't miss knowing everything immediately. The place wasn't asking me to pay attention to more. It was asking me to pay attention to less, and that felt manageable. By the end of the first week, I had stopped checking my phone automatically. I left it on the counter for hours at a time. That choice felt small, but it carried weight. I was practicing disconnection without realizing it. I believed I was learning how to rest. I didn't yet understand I was also learning how to be cut off. I remember keeping track of days by meals instead of dates. Breakfast, then whatever the afternoon became, then dinner when the light shifted. That rhythm felt stable, it gave structure without pressure. I thought stability was the same as security. I didn't question whether that belief depended on outside systems continuing to function somewhere else. The house encouraged assumptions like that. It let comfort masquerade as certainty. I didn't see the flaw because nothing challenged it yet. Quiet has a way of hiding its conditions. I mistook stillness for permanence without realizing how fragile that assumption was at all then. The change didn't announce itself as danger. It arrived as something incomplete. I was standing at the counter rinsing a mug when my phone vibrated once and stopped. No sound followed. No banner, just a brief acknowledgement that something had tried and failed to reach me. When I picked it up, the screen showed a loading icon that never resolved. I waited longer than necessary, then set it back down. At first, I treated it like weather. Out here, interruptions were normal. Trees blocked signals, distance softened everything. I told myself the world beyond the lake was still intact, just momentarily out of reach. That explanation felt reasonable, so I didn't look for another one. Later that afternoon, I tried checking the forecast. The page, half loaded, froze, then cleared itself. No error message, no warning, just absence. I remember thinking how strange it was that the app didn't even bother pretending. It wasn't broken, it was unreachable. There's a difference, even if it takes time to recognize it. We talked about it briefly and not seriously, more like an observation you make while passing someone in a hallway. I said something about the connection being worse than usual. The response was a nod, not concern. Neither of us wanted to be the one to elevate it into a problem. I took the kayak out near sunset, paddling along the edge of the lake where the water darkened early. Movement usually carried sound, but that evening felt muted. No distant engines, no voices traveling across the surface. The lake held everything close. When I stopped paddling, the silence felt heavier than before, like it had weight instead of space. On the far shore, I noticed a cabin that usually showed signs of life on weekends. A porch light, smoke from a chimney. That evening it looked abandoned, curtains drawn tight, dock empty. I told myself it was a weekday, people had jobs. The explanation came easily. I didn't question why I needed one at all. That night, the radio produced static where it usually pulled in a low, uneven signal. I adjusted the dial slowly, listening for anything familiar. All I found were fragments that cut out as soon as they formed. It felt less like interference and more like distance had suddenly increased, as if everything else had stepped back at once. I slept poorly, not from fear but from restlessness. My mind kept circling details that refused to settle. When morning came, it brought no new information. The sky looked ordinary. The water lay flat. Birds moved along the shoreline without urgency. If something was wrong elsewhere, it hadn't reached this place yet. I tried reaching someone directly. The call didn't fail. It didn't ring either. The screen simply returned to idle, as if I'd never touched it. That was the moment I paused longer than usual. Failure implies effort. This felt like dismissal. I walked outside and checked the road out of habit. The long stretch of gravel looked unchanged. Tire tracks from our last arrival were still faintly visible. Nothing suggested urgency. Nothing suggested interruption. The environment was convincing in its normalcy. That's what unsettled me later, when I thought back on it. Not the lack of information, but how calm everything remained, while that lack persisted. Problems usually announce themselves with noise. This one didn't. It simply removed reference points and left everything else untouched. I didn't say any of this out loud. Naming it would have given it weight. Instead, I focused on small tasks, cutting vegetables, cleaning the sink, straightening things that didn't need it. Activity helped keep the unease undefined. That first signal didn't warn us, it tested us. It showed how quickly we'd accept uncertainty if it arrived quietly enough. I didn't recognize it as a threshold at the time. I thought it was a glitch. I assumed the outside world was still there, operating on its own schedule, waiting for us to reconnect when conditions improved. What I didn't understand yet was that reconnection requires both sides to still be listening. The absence became noticeable through routine failure. Morning usually brought something external. A weather update, a delayed notification, a fragment of news loading halfway before correcting itself. That day delivered nothing. I stood by the window with my phone in hand, refreshing out of habit rather than expectation. The screen stayed blank, responsive but empty, like a door that opened onto a wall. I turned the radio on again. More deliberately this time. I adjusted the antenna, shifted its angle, even moved it closer to the window. Static filled the space where voices should have been. Not the erratic kind that suggests poor reception, but a steady wash that never sharpened. I remembered how often I'd complained about bad signal before, how casual that irritation had been. Now I found myself hoping for even the faintest intrusion. We tried different devices. A laptop. A backup phone we kept powered off. None of them produced anything useful. No error messages. No alerts. Just the same clean refusal to connect. It wasn't dramatic. That made it harder to respond to. Emergencies usually demand reaction. This felt like being ignored. Outside, the lake reflected the sky with uncomfortable precision. Clouds passed, mirrored perfectly, as if nothing had been disturbed. I watched for movement across the water, expecting a boat or distant ripple. The surface stayed uninterrupted. Even the occasional recreational traffic that normally appeared mid-morning was absent. I checked the time twice, convinced I'd misread it. By afternoon, the quiet felt intentional. Not peaceful, but structured. The world hadn't grown louder somewhere else. It had narrowed. Sounds that normally layered the day were missing. No aircraft overhead. No engines drifting from unseen roads. Even the wind moved differently, softer against the trees like it didn't want to announce itself. We walked down to the dock without discussing why. Standing there, we looked across the lake toward the far tree line. Usually someone would be fishing by then. A figure moving slowly, casting and reeling. That day, the shoreline remained empty. Cabins that normally showed signs of occupancy sat closed and still. No smoke. No movement. The lake looked staged. I caught myself listening harder than necessary, straining for proof that something else was happening beyond our view. My ears adjusted until I could hear details I normally filtered out. The faint creak of wood underfoot, insects moving through grass near the bank. My own breathing. Those sounds felt too close, as if everything had collapsed inward. We talked more than we had the day before, but less than normal. Questions surfaced without answers. Was it regional, weather-related, a power issue somewhere farther out? Each possibility relied on the assumption that systems were functioning elsewhere. That assumption grew thinner with every hour that passed without contradiction. I checked the road again near dusk. No dust, no tire noise. The stretch of gravel looked undisturbed, like it hadn't been used in days. I tried to imagine a reason for that. Construction delays, seasonal closures. The explanations felt rehearsed, like lines I was reciting to myself rather than conclusions I believed. That night, the house felt smaller, not physically but perceptually. The walls seemed closer. Light from inside didn't spill far beyond the windows. Darkness pressed in without resistance. I locked the door out of habit, then paused, unsure why I'd bothered. Habit filled gaps where certainty should have been. I lay awake listening to the lake. Water lapped against the dock in uneven intervals, the same sound as always. What disturbed me wasn't the sound itself, but how little it changed. No interruptions, no counterpoints, just repetition without variation. It felt less like nature continuing, and more like a loop running without input. I realized then that silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's the absence of response. We had reached out repeatedly, and nothing had reached back. That imbalance shifted something in me. Connection had always been assumed, even when unreliable. Now it felt optional, conditional, or worse, unavailable. The quiet stopped feeling like something we had chosen. It began to feel imposed. I didn't say that out loud. Saying it would have made it real. Instead, I stared at the ceiling and counted the spaces between sounds, marking time by what failed to happen. There are moments when awareness changes without announcing itself. That was one of them. The lake hadn't changed. The house hadn't changed. We had. We were no longer waiting for information. We were waiting for confirmation that waiting still made sense. The confirmation didn't arrive as a headline or a broadcast. It came through something we weren't meant to see clearly. I was on the dock early, more out of habit than purpose, skimming the lake with binoculars we'd brought for birdwatching. The far shoreline looked unchanged, until I focused long enough to notice movement that didn't fit the setting. A figure emerged near one of the cabins across the water. Not walking with intention. Not carrying anything. Just moving, stopping, then starting again at an angle that made no sense. I watched longer than I should have, waiting for context to fill in. It never did. The person stumbled into the open, arms hanging unevenly, posture wrong in a way that set off something deep and physical in me. I lowered the binoculars and felt my stomach tighten. There was no curiosity left in the moment, only recognition. I didn't know exactly what I was seeing, but I knew what it wasn't. It wasn't someone fishing. It wasn't a neighbor heading to their dock. It wasn't a coincidence that could be brushed aside with logic. I raised the binoculars again. The figure collapsed near the water's edge, then dragged itself upright using the side of the cabin. No one came to help. No door opened. The stillness around them felt deliberate, like the area had been abandoned rather than momentarily empty. I went back inside without speaking. I didn't need to explain why. The look on my face did that work for me. We stood together near the window, watching the far shore in silence. The binoculars passed between us once. Neither of us said what we were thinking. Saying it would have closed a door neither of us was ready to shut. Time passed without resolution. The figure disappeared behind the cabin and didn't re-emerge. That absence didn't bring relief. It made things worse. The mind fills gaps aggressively when given no alternatives. Later that day, we heard something we couldn't place at first. A sound carried across the water, thin but unmistakably human. Not speech. Not a call for help. It was strained, uneven, and ended abruptly. We looked at each other, both of us frozen in the same realization. Sound carries too well across water for coincidence. Whatever made that noise was close enough to matter. I thought about going out in the boat. The idea surfaced and died within seconds. Distance had always felt manageable before, and now it felt absolute. The lake wasn't a feature anymore. It was a divider, and on the other side of it, something had broken down completely. We searched for confirmation in the only ways available to us. Old downloaded articles, cached maps, anything that might suggest this was contained or temporary. Everything we found was outdated, disconnected from whatever was happening now. The absence of new information stopped being neutral. It became evidence. That evening, as the light dropped, we saw another movement near the trees. This one was faster, less controlled. It vanished quickly, but not before I registered the urgency into its motion. Nothing about it suggested survival. It suggested reaction. I realized then that waiting for clarity was no longer reasonable. The outside world wasn't delayed. It was inaccessible. Whatever was unfolding wasn't passing through. It was settling in. We locked the doors earlier than usual. Not because of what we had seen, but because of what we could no longer assume. Safety had shifted from default to conditional. The lake house had gone from remote to isolated, without changing its location at all. That night I didn't sleep. Not from panic, but from calculation. Every sound outside carried weight now. Every absence demanded interpretation. The part of me that believed this was a short disruption went quiet, not with argument, but with surrender. The moment wasn't dramatic. There was no single image I could point to and say that was it. It was the accumulation of contradictions finally aligning. The world we'd stepped away from hadn't paused. It had fractured, and we were no longer observers waiting for it to stabilize. We were inside the consequences, cut off, watching understanding arrive slower than it should have. The shift wasn't immediate. It crept in through reconsideration. I started seeing the house not as shelter, but as a fixed point with limited options attached to it. Walls that once defined comfort that now marked boundaries. Windows that framed calm scenes also functioned as reminders of how little we could reach beyond them. Nothing about the structure had changed. My interpretation of it had. I walked the perimeter that morning with a different focus. Distance to the nearest road, the condition of the boat, the angle of the shoreline where footing was weakest. These were details I had overlooked because I hadn't needed them before. The lake had always been a buffer. Now it felt like a constraint that demanded planning rather than appreciation. Inside, we began speaking in conditional terms. If the power holds, if the weather shifts, if someone comes close enough to be seen. Our language adjusted before our actions did. I noticed how often sentences ended without conclusions. We weren't solving problems yet. We were acknowledging that problems existed. The refrigerator hummed steadily, a sound I'd stopped noticing until it carried meaning. I found myself listening to it, aware that silence in that context would mean something entirely different. I checked the breaker panel even though nothing had tripped. Habit disguised as diligence, I wanted reassurance from systems I'd previously ignored. We talked about supplies without turning it into inventory. How long certain foods would last if we stretched them. What could be substituted when something ran out. Which items had single uses and which could be repurposed. These conversations stayed hypothetical, but the tone had changed. There was no humor left in them. I went down to the dock again and studied the boat with narrowed expectations. Fuel wasn't just fuel anymore. It represented range, choice, and risk bundled together. Taking the boat meant exposure. Leaving it tied up meant staying blind to whatever was unfolding elsewhere. Neither option felt neutral. The lake itself had stopped feeling expansive. Its surface no longer suggested possibility. It suggested separation. Water that had once been calming now looked like a stretch we couldn't cross casually. I imagined trying to outrun something in it and dismissed the thought immediately. Distance favors the prepared. We were still transitioning. We debated whether staying put made sense. Not seriously. Not yet. The discussion never reached planning. It hovered around discomfort. Leaving would mean confronting unknowns. Staying meant accepting that unknowns would eventually arrive here instead. The house didn't offer guidance. It simply existed, indifferent to our deliberation. Night amplified everything. Sounds carried farther, but they also lacked context. A branch breaking somewhere along the shoreline felt louder than it should have. I couldn't tell if that was perception or reality. I found myself standing still more often, listening without moving, measuring how long it took for tension to subside when nothing followed. We adjusted small behaviors without acknowledging why. Curtains closed earlier, lights dimmed instead of switched on fully, doors checked twice. These actions weren't fear-driven, they were preventative, the kind of changes you make when you realize assumptions are no longer reliable. I caught myself watching the water instead of the trees. My attention shifted toward the most obvious approach path, even though it had never been used that way before. The realization that isolation could be approached from multiple directions unsettled me more than any single threat. What disturbed me most was how little reassurance the setting offered once perspective changed. The same features that had sold us on the place now required justification. Remoteness demanded self-sufficiency. Quiet demanded vigilance. Distance demanded planning. I thought about how often people equate being far away with being safe, how rarely they consider what that distance removes along with danger. Help, Information and reinforcement don't travel well without infrastructure. We had traded access for calm without accounting for the cost. That was when I understood the mistake in our original logic. Isolation doesn't protect on its own. It only delays contact. Whether that delay works in your favor depends on what eventually arrives and how prepared you are when it does. The lake house hadn't failed us. It was doing exactly what it was built to do. The problem was that the world it was designed to sit beside no longer existed in the same form. Safety had stopped being a location. It had become a moving target, and we were standing still, realizing that comfort and protection had never been the same thing at all. Taking stock didn't happen all at once. It unfolded through use. You only learn what matters when something is nearly gone or suddenly necessary. I noticed it first with water. The pump worked, but it worked because electricity still did. That conditional mattered now. I filled containers slowly, aware that the act itself assumed a future I could no longer take for granted. Food revealed itself in layers. Fresh items dictated short timelines. Dry goods offered flexibility, but required planning. We weren't starving, not even close, but abundance felt different when resupply was no longer a drive away. Meals shifted from preference to intention. What we ate today shaped what we could eat later. Waste stopped being abstract. Heat mattered more than comfort suggested. The wood stove had been decorative in practice, practical in theory. I split logs with attention instead of rhythm, stacking them where moisture wouldn't reach. The act grounded me, but it also underlined dependency. Warmth required effort, and effort required time that might be needed elsewhere. Lighting changed how the house functioned. We conserved without formal rules. Lamps replaced overhead fixtures. Candles stayed unlit unless needed. Darkness became something we negotiated with instead of pushed away. I realized how much of daily life relies on constant illumination, and how quickly that reliance feels exposed when alternatives are finite. Tools surfaced naturally. Items I'd barely considered before gained relevance through proximity. A basic first aid kit, extra batteries, duct tape. None of it felt sufficient or insufficient in isolation. Context determined value. I kept mental notes rather than lists, tracking what had been touched and what remained untouched. Use was the most honest form of inventory. What we didn't have became clearer faster. Medical redundancy was thin. Communication options were non-existent beyond what we'd already exhausted. Transportation depended entirely on fuel we couldn't replace. Each absence carried its own weight. Not panic, but gravity. Missing items don't announce themselves until the possibility of needing them becomes real. We avoided turning the process into formal accounting. Writing things down felt like admitting permanence. Instead, we talked through scenarios casually, as if discussing weather that might never arrive. If the power went out, if the road stayed empty, if someone appeared unexpectedly. Each conditional carved space in our thinking without forcing commitment. I tested small assumptions quietly, tried starting the generator we'd barely used. It worked, but the sound traveled farther than I liked. I shut it down quickly, reminded that visibility wasn't just visual. Sound carried consequence too. Capability without discretion felt dangerous. The house itself offered limitations I'd ignored before. Storage wasn't designed for long-term redundancy. Waste disposal assumed regular service. Even something as simple as trash became a consideration. Everything functioned because normal patterns existed somewhere else. Those patterns were now hypothetical. I noticed how often I paused before using something. A roll of paper towels, a match, a charged device. The pause wasn't hesitation. It was evaluation. I weighed replacement against necessity automatically, a habit forming without instruction. What surprised me most was how uneven preparedness felt. We were well positioned in some ways and exposed in others. Comfort had masked imbalance. The lake house was built for escape, not endurance. That distinction mattered more with every passing hour. Emotionally, the process stayed flat. No speeches, no resolve, just adjustment. I felt steadier when my hands were busy, less so when I stopped moving. Action gave shape to uncertainty without resolving it. That was enough for the moment. By the end of the day, nothing dramatic had changed. We hadn't solved anything. We hadn't fixed the larger problem. But our understanding had shifted. We no longer measured security by how peaceful things looked. We measured it by how many options remained if peace ended. What we had could sustain us briefly. What we didn't have would eventually demand decisions. The gap between those two realities defined the path ahead. I didn't know how long that gap would hold, only that ignoring it was no longer possible. The decision didn't arrive as a debate. It surfaced as a conclusion we both reached without formal agreement. Waiting had been useful when uncertainty was informational. Now uncertainty had become structural. Doing nothing was no longer neutral. It carried direction even if we pretended it didn't. The boat was the axis everything rotated around. It represented movement, contact, and exposure in equal measure. Leaving the dock meant crossing a boundary we had been using as insulation. Staying tied up meant accepting blindness. Neither option offered safety. One offered possibility. We circled the subject carefully. Not in one conversation, but across several incomplete ones. I'd mention fuel levels while doing something else. The response would come later, framed as a question about distance. We were mapping consequences without naming the choice yet. The shoreline across the lake had gone quiet in a way that felt settled rather than temporary. Whatever had happened there had moved on or collapsed entirely. That absence created a pressure of its own. Not knowing invited imagination, and imagination was worse than observation. At least, observation allowed correction. The moment crystallized when we noticed something missing. A buoy near the inlet that usually marked shallow water had drifted closer overnight. Wind could explain that. Current could too. What unsettled me was that I hadn't noticed movement to account for it. Small changes had started happening without our awareness. That meant our window for passive monitoring was closing. I walked down to the dock alone and untied the bow line without committing to anything else. The rope slipped free easily. That small act carried weight. It meant I had accepted that a return to simple observation was unlikely. Once the boat moved, we would be participants, not observers. We didn't pack much. Overpacking would have implied intention we weren't ready to own. A small bag with water, a radio that hadn't worked yet but might, binoculars, and a knife that had never been used for more than utility. Each item felt symbolic in its restraint. We weren't preparing for a journey. We were preparing for contact. The engine hesitated before starting, a brief delay that tightened everything in me. When it caught, the sound felt too loud. I listened for echoes, for response, for anything that suggested attention. Nothing answered. The lake absorbed the noise without complaint, which somehow made it worse. As we pulled away from the dock, the house receded faster than expected. Perspective shifted quickly on open water. The windows reflected light differently from this angle, making the place look unfamiliar. That startled me more than distance. The house had already begun to feel less like a constant. We didn't talk much as we moved. The water was calm, but my focus wasn't on navigation. I watched the shoreline instead, scanning for movement, for signs of life or collapse. The quiet felt brittle now, as if it could crack under pressure. Approaching the far side, details sharpened. The dock near the abandoned cabin listed unevenly. A chair lay overturned where it shouldn't have been. None of it proved anything on its own. Together it formed a pattern I didn't want to finish interpreting. We slowed before reaching land. That hesitation wasn't fear, it was recalibration. Once we stepped off the boat, we would be operating without retreat as an immediate option. Distance works both ways. Crossing it commits you to whatever waits on the other side. I realized then that this wasn't about gathering information anymore. It was about deciding what kind of risk we could live with. Remaining isolated meant letting conditions shape us without input. Moving meant accepting consequences we couldn't predict. The boat drifted forward as I cut the engine. The lake went quiet again, but it felt different now. Charged. Expectant. We were no longer protected by distance. We had converted it into vulnerability on purpose. That was the moment everything changed. Not because of what we found, but because of what we chose to expose ourselves to. From that point on, survival wouldn't be defined by how well we avoided contact. It would be defined by how we handled it when avoidance stopped being an option. The shore felt wrong the moment our feet touched it. Not dangerous yet, just unsettled. The ground near the dock was packed down in uneven patches, as if weight had shifted back and forth without purpose. I crouched and pressed my fingers into one of the impressions. It wasn't old. The edges hadn't collapsed. Whatever had been here hadn't left long ago. We moved slowly, not out of fear, but out of restraint. Sound carried too easily in that space. The cabin across the water looked smaller up close, less like a destination and more like a shell someone had stepped out of in a hurry. One shutter hung loose, tapping faintly against the frame. That repetitive sound set my nerves on edge more than silence ever had. Near the porch, I saw evidence that erased any remaining doubt. A backpack lay half open beside the steps, not torn, not scavenged, just dropped. Inside were items chosen deliberately: water bottle, spare socks, a folded map with handwritten notes along the margins. Someone had planned to move, not stay. That distinction mattered. Planning meant awareness. Awareness meant others were responding to the same collapse we were. I felt a flicker of relief that surprised me. It wasn't hope. It was validation. The quiet hadn't been personal. We hadn't misread the signs. The world beyond the lake hadn't simply gone dormant. It had shifted, and people were adapting in ways we couldn't see from a distance. The relief didn't last. Footprints led away from the cabin toward the tree line, uneven and overlapping. More than one set. That detail changed everything. We weren't dealing with a single isolated person. There had been movement, interaction, possibly conflict. The lake house had felt solitary because we had been insulated, not because we were alone. We followed the trail only far enough to confirm direction. The forest swallowed details quickly. Leaves disguised depth. Shadows hid scale. I stopped before momentum carried us farther than we could justify. Information has diminishing returns when it increases exposure. That's when we heard it. Not close, but close enough to be directional. A voice carried through the trees, strained and abrupt. It wasn't a call for help. It wasn't speech meant to be understood. It was a reaction, sharp and uncontrolled, followed by movement that scattered birds into the air. We froze. Instinct anchored us in place. Whatever had made that sound was interacting with something else. The absence of follow-up noise suggested resolution, not escape. I didn't need to imagine details. The pattern was enough. I backed away first, slow and deliberate. We retraced our steps without discussion. The dock felt farther than it had minutes earlier. Space stretches when attention sharpens. Every branch snap sounded intentional. Every shift in light suggested motion. Halfway back, I noticed something else that confirmed our mistake in assuming solitude. Marks along the shoreline near the waterline. Dragged lines where something heavy had been pulled toward the lake, then abandoned. I didn't inspect them closely. I didn't need to. The implication carried weight without elaboration. When the boat came back into view, I felt tension release in a way that surprised me. Not because it meant safety, but because it meant choice. Retreat was still available. That mattered more than security. We pushed off quickly. The engine caught on the first turn this time, a small mercy that felt undeserved. As the boat pulled away, I looked back once, scanning the tree line for movement. I didn't see anyone. That didn't reassure me. Crossing back felt shorter, though I knew it wasn't. The water stayed calm, indifferent to what had just been confirmed. The lake didn't separate us from emptiness. It separated us from others who were navigating the same collapse with fewer buffers and fewer assumptions. Back at our dock, we secured the boat without ceremony. Neither of us spoke immediately. Words would have flattened the meaning of what we'd seen. Proof has a way of altering responsibility. Once you know others are out there, isolation stops being passive. It becomes a decision with consequences. We hadn't found allies. We hadn't confirmed threats in detail. What we'd gained was clarity. The lake house wasn't an outlier. It was part of a wider, fragmented landscape of survival. People were moving. People were making choices. Some of them were failing. That knowledge shifted something fundamental. We were no longer waiting to see if contact would happen. Contact had already happened. We'd just been distant enough to avoid acknowledging it. The lake hadn't protected us from the world. It had delayed our involvement. As we stood there, listening to the quiet reassert itself, I understood that solitude had expired as an assumption. From that point forward, every decision would need to account for others moving through the same spaces, driven by pressures we couldn't predict. The proof wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself with confrontation. It revealed itself through absence, abandonment, and sound carrying where it shouldn't have. That was enough. We weren't alone anymore. We had simply been late to the realization. Contact didn't happen the way I'd imagined it might. There was no sudden arrival, no approach from the trees or across the water. It unfolded through proximity and choice. Late the next morning, I noticed movement near the bend in the shoreline where the trees thinned. Not a shape stepping into view, but a change in alignment. Something that hadn't been there before now was, I watched for several minutes before saying anything. A small fire pit had been cleared, fresh enough that the ground still looked disturbed. No smoke rose from it. Whoever had made it understood discretion. That alone told me more than I wanted to know. This wasn't someone acting on panic. It was someone thinking carefully. We didn't announce ourselves. We observed. A figure appeared briefly, then vanished again behind the brush. No wave. No call. Just presence. The kind that lets you know you've been noticed without confirming intent. I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with distance. Eventually I moved closer, stopping well short of the tree line. Hands visible. Pace slow. Not because I expected cooperation, but because misinterpretation carries cost. I spoke once, clearly, without urgency, a simple acknowledgement. I wasn't offering help or asking questions. I was signaling awareness. The response came after a pause that felt calculated. A person stepped into view far enough to be seen, not far enough to be approached. Their posture was guarded but stable, no erratic movement and no visible injury. That detail mattered more than words. Stability suggested time spent adapting, not fleeing. We exchanged names without elaboration. No one volunteered background. No one asked for it either. Information felt like currency, and neither side wanted to spend too much too soon. I noticed how carefully every sentence was constructed, how nothing unnecessary slipped out. The conversation stayed narrow. We talked about weather patterns, about the lake's behavior, about how long we'd each been there. Questions circled each other without landing directly. It wasn't distrust exactly. It was calibration. We were both assessing what the other believed was normal now. At one point, they glanced towards the house behind me, then back at the water. The look wasn't envious, it was evaluative. I realized then that we were being measured the same way we were measuring them. Shelter signals capacity. Capacity attracts attention. They mentioned others without naming them. groups that had passed through, situations that hadn't gone well. The phrasing stayed vague, but the implications were clear. Movement increased risk. Staying put carried its own consequences. Nothing was framed as advice. It was presented as observation. I offered nothing concrete in return, not out of malice, but out of preservation. Trust felt premature. This wasn't a meeting between neighbors. It was an encounter between survivors operating under incompatible assumptions. Cooperation requires alignment. We didn't have that yet. The exchange ended without resolution. No agreement, no plan, just acknowledgement that we were occupying overlapping territory. When they stepped back into the trees, it wasn't retreat. It was repositioning. That distinction lingered with me longer than anything said. Walking back, I became acutely aware of visibility, how the house sat against the water, how movement on the dock could be tracked from multiple angles. I hadn't thought about sightlines before. Now they rearranged the space in my head. We didn't discuss the encounter immediately. Processing took precedence over commentary. I replayed details instead. The measured speech, the lack of urgency, the ease with which they disengaged. These weren't signs of weakness. They were signs of practice. What unsettled me most was the absence of reassurance. No one claimed things would improve. No one suggested collaboration as an obvious next step. The interaction existed for its own sake, not as a bridge. That told me something fundamental had shifted in how people related to each other. Trust hadn't disappeared. It had become conditional and expensive. Shared circumstances weren't enough to earn it anymore. Experience mattered, so did restraint. By the time evening settled in, the encounter had reshaped our thinking more than any confirmed threat had. We were no longer dealing with a binary world of safety and danger. We were navigating a landscape populated by others making parallel calculations, each one adjusting in real time. The lake still separated us physically, but that separation felt thinner now, not because of proximity, but because intention had crossed it. We had been seen, assessed, and left behind intentionally. That carried implications we couldn't ignore. Interaction hadn't brought comfort. It had brought complexity. From that point forward, survival wasn't just about managing resources or avoiding the infected. It was about existing within a network of unspoken boundaries, where every encounter altered the balance in ways that couldn't be undone. The lake didn't change all at once. It revealed its failure gradually, through conditions we hadn't accounted for, because we never needed to. The first sign came after a night of steady rain. Not a storm, just persistence. By morning, the waterline had crept higher along the rocks near the dock, erasing the shallow edge that once made approach predictable. I noticed debris drifting closer to shore. Branches, leaves, things carried from elsewhere. The lake had always felt contained, its surface calm and self-contained. Now it looked connected to places we couldn't see. Movement implied access. Access implied vulnerability. Wind altered sound in ways that unsettled me. What used to dissipate across open water now carried with direction and clarity. A noise from the far side didn't feel distant anymore. It felt aligned. I found myself turning towards sounds instinctively, recalculating where they might originate instead of dismissing them as background. The rain softened the ground near the shoreline, creating paths where there had been resistance before. Footing improved where it shouldn't have. I tested the slope with my boot and felt how easily weight transferred. A person could move along that edge without struggling now. That realization lingered longer than the rain itself. I walked the perimeter again, tracing angles I'd ignored. The lake curved inward near the western bank, narrowing the distance between trees and water. In dry conditions, that gap was awkward to navigate. With saturation, it became passable. The barrier we'd trusted was contingent on weather we didn't control. The boat no longer felt like the only means of crossing. That shift mattered. Assumptions collapse fastest when alternatives emerge unexpectedly. I imagined someone approaching quietly along the waterline, using cover we dismissed as impractical. The image didn't require imagination. The terrain supported it. At dusk, fog rolled in low and thick, blurring the horizon until water and sky merged. Visibility dropped without warning. The lake erased depth cues we relied on. Sound behaved unpredictably, bending and distorting direction. I stood still longer than necessary, listening for something I couldn't define. We adjusted instinctively. Lights stayed lower. Curtains remained closed even during the day. Movement near windows slowed. These weren't defensive maneuvers yet. They were acknowledgements. The environment had shifted and our posture followed. I realized how much we had depended on the lake to define approach. It had simplified threat assessment by limiting vectors. Now those vectors multiplied. The shoreline became a gradient instead of a line. That complexity demanded attention we hadn't budgeted for. What troubled me most was how subtle the change felt. No dramatic flooding. No violent weather. Just enough alteration to invalidate a core assumption. The kind of change that slips past you if you're not watching closely. I thought about how many decisions we'd anchored to the idea of separation. How often we'd told ourselves distance equaled time. That logic assumed static conditions. The lake wasn't static. Neither was anything else. Standing there, I understood that barriers don't fail loudly. They fail quietly, through conditions that render them irrelevant. The lake hadn't been breached. It had been bypassed by circumstance. From that point on, I stopped thinking of the water as protection. It was a feature again, nothing more. Useful, unpredictable, and no longer on our side by default. The realization didn't bring panic. It brought urgency without noise. Planning shifted inward. We weren't just isolated anymore. We were exposed in ways we hadn't prepared for, not because we'd done something wrong, but because the environment had moved on without consulting us. The lake still looked calm. That was the problem. It offered no visual warning of the role it had stopped playing. Inaction carries weight once time stops feeling abundant. At first, staying put felt responsible. Movement introduces variables. Remaining stationary reduces them. That logic held until the environment began changing faster than we were. The balance tipped quietly, without a moment that demanded response. Only accumulation that made hesitation expensive. I noticed it in small delays. Tasks that used to wait until afternoon moved into morning. Conversations we postponed resurfaced sooner, stripped of casual tone. The house had begun to operate on tighter margins. Comfort still existed, but it no longer absorbed mistakes the way it had before. Food consumption shifted again, not because supplies were low, but because uncertainty stretched forward without an endpoint. Every meal implied future meals that might not be supported by the same conditions. We adjusted portions without discussing it. Appetite followed awareness, not hunger. The generator remained unused, not out of restraint, but out of calculation. Noise mapped presence. Presence invited curiosity. Curiosity carried consequences. I weighed the benefit of redundancy against the cost of announcing capability. Capability attracts attention faster than weakness. That inversion unsettled me more than scarcity would have. Days passed with no new information, but that absence began working against us. Without input, planning degraded. Decisions rely on reference. We were operating in a vacuum that rewarded neither patience nor action definitively. The longer we stayed still, the more our choices narrowed, around assumptions that might already be obsolete. Psychological strain crept in through repetition. Not of events, but of vigilance. Watching the same angles, listening for the same sounds, checking the same points along the shoreline. Familiarity dulled alertness even as stakes increased. That contradiction worried me more than fatigue. I caught myself rehearsing explanations that no one had asked for yet. Why we were here, what we could offer, what we would refuse. These internal scripts weren't preparations for dialogue. They were signs that interaction was becoming inevitable, whether we initiated it or not. The encounter near the trees lingered in my thinking. Not the words exchanged, but the ease with which it ended. They hadn't pressed. They hadn't probed. That restraint suggested alternatives, other locations, other plans. Mobility we lacked by choice. Staying still wasn't neutral if others were repositioning. Weather forecasts no longer existed, but weather still arrived. A colder night shifted how long the stove needed to burn. A warmer afternoon spoiled food faster than expected. Variability punished static systems. Adaptation required movement, even if that movement stayed within familiar boundaries. I began to see the house less as a base and more as an anchor. Anchors stabilize, but they also limit drift. In calm conditions, that's an advantage. In changing ones, it can prevent adjustment. We had secured ourselves without asking whether the ground beneath us would remain worth securing. The lake reflected this tension. Its surface stayed smooth most days, inviting the illusion that nothing urgent was happening. But below that surface, currents shifted with wind and runoff, invisible but influential. I started thinking of our situation the same way. Externally calm, internally under pressure. We discussed leaving without planning it, talked around the edges of the idea, routes that might exist, risks that would come with movement. No option sounded clean. That realization didn't justify staying. It highlighted how little time we'd spent imagining alternatives when isolation felt safe. What staying still cost us wasn't immediate danger. It cost flexibility. It cost initiative. The longer we waited, the more reactive we became. Reactivity is expensive because it removes choice under stress. I recognized then that survival wasn't about finding the safest place and holding it. It was about maintaining the ability to respond as conditions shifted. The house offered familiarity, not adaptability. Familiarity can become a liability when the world stops behaving predictably. That understanding didn't demand action right away. It demanded honesty. Staying was no longer the default. It was a decision with mounting consequences. Each day spent motionless narrowed the range of futures available to us. I didn't know when we would move or how. I only knew that stillness had stopped buying time. It was spending it instead. Easy. The plan took shape because it had to, not because it was elegant. We built it out of constraints rather than ambition. Limited fuel, unreliable information, terrain we understood unevenly. The goal wasn't escape in the dramatic sense. It was repositioning, a controlled shift that would widen our options instead of narrowing them further. We chose a window early in the morning when sound traveled less cleanly and visibility stayed inconsistent. Fog was a variable, not a shield, but it introduced uncertainty that worked both ways. The route avoided the main stretch of shoreline and angled toward an inlet we'd marked earlier, a place where land access looked manageable without advertising movement. Preparation stayed minimal by design. Overloading ourselves would slow response. We packed essentials and left behind anything that implied permanence. The act of choosing what not to take felt heavier than filling the bag. Each item left behind acknowledged the possibility that we might not return under the same conditions. The lake cooperated at first. Water stayed flat, the engine behaved. The crossing felt controlled, almost routine, which made me suspicious. Success that arrives without resistance invites overconfidence. I kept scanning the shoreline, watching for changes that didn't belong to us. Landing went smoothly. No immediate signs of presence. No fresh tracks near the waterline. The inlet provided cover from multiple angles, just as we'd hoped. For a moment, it felt like we'd regained initiative. We were moving with purpose instead of reacting to pressure. That feeling didn't last. As we moved inland, the ground changed texture faster than expected. Mud replaced firm soil, forcing detours that weren't accounted for. Each adjustment slowed us. Each slowdown increased exposure. The plan absorbed these changes poorly. It hadn't been built for adaptability. It had been built for precision. We heard movement before we saw anything, not close enough to identify, but close enough to register direction. I signaled for stillness and waited longer than was comfortable. The sound didn't resolve. It multiplied. Not louder, just more frequent, coming from different angles without coordination. That was the first indication we'd misjudged the area, not because of danger, but because of density. Too many unknowns converged too quickly. The inlet wasn't isolated. It was transitional. A place others had passed through for the same reasons we had. We adjusted course again, trying to maintain momentum without drawing attention. That balance proved fragile. A branch snapped underfoot, sharper than it should have been. The sound carried. Almost immediately, something responded. Not verbally, spatially, movement shifted toward us without announcement. Retreat became the priority without discussion. Not because the plan had failed entirely, but because its assumptions no longer held. Returning to the boat required retracing steps through ground that had already been disturbed. Disturbance leaves memory in the environment. We felt that awareness pressing in as we moved. Reaching the shoreline felt slower than the approach, even though distance hadn't changed. The boat waited where we'd left it, unchanged. An anchor point that felt suddenly fragile. As we pushed off, I caught sight of movement near the trees, not close enough to confirm intent, close enough to confirm awareness. The engine started on the first try, but the sound cut through the quiet with more force than before. I didn't look back immediately. I focused on keeping the bow steady and the wake minimal. When I finally glanced over my shoulder, the tree line looked still. That didn't reassure me. Stillness had lost that function. Crossing back, the lake felt narrower. Perspective collapsed under pressure. The house came into view sooner than expected, its familiar outline offering relief and disappointment in equal measure. We'd gained information, but we'd also revealed ourselves in ways we couldn't measure. Docking was rushed. Lines tied faster than usual. Movements clipped. The plan had not ended in disaster, but it hadn't succeeded either. Partial success is dangerous because it invites reinterpretation. I resisted the urge to frame it positively. Inside, we sat without speaking. Adrenaline dissipated unevenly, leaving behind fatigue that felt older than the day itself. The plan had almost worked, which meant it would be tempting to try again with minor adjustments. That temptation worried me more than outright failure would have. What we learned was uncomfortable. Movement was possible, but not clean. Others were navigating the same spaces with similar urgency. No route existed in isolation anymore. Every plan intersected with unknown intentions. The plan hadn't failed because it was reckless. It failed because the environment no longer supported linear thinking. Control had become conditional. Near success proved that preparation mattered, but it also proved that margins were thinner than we'd assumed. That realization settled heavily. We hadn't escaped. We hadn't secured anything. We had tested our assumptions and found them wanting. The house still stood. The lake still separated us. But the idea that careful planning alone could restore stability had fractured. Almost working wasn't enough anymore. The cost of trying again without rethinking everything felt too high. What changed wasn't our situation as much as our orientation to it. After the plan collapsed back into the house with us, I stopped thinking in terms of solutions. Solutions imply endings. What we were dealing with no longer moved toward resolution. It stretched, adjusted, and demanded response without promising closure. The lake house didn't feel like a failure. It felt like a fact. A fixed element we now understood more clearly. We weren't trapped, but we weren't free either. We occupied a middle state that required constant attention. That awareness reshaped how we moved through the space. Nothing was casual anymore, but nothing was frantic. Our conversations shortened, not because there was less to say, but because efficiency replaced reassurance. Words became tools instead of comfort. We learned to read each other's pauses, to recognize when something didn't need discussion. Shared experience compressed communication without erasing connection. I noticed how my thinking had changed. I no longer imagined returning to what life had been. I imagined continuity instead. Days following days, without reference to a before or after. That mental shift steadied me more than optimism ever had. Hope had narrowed. Acceptance had widened. The house adapted alongside us. Not physically, but functionally. Rooms acquired roles they hadn't held before. Windows became points of assessment rather than views. Storage became strategic instead of convenient. Even rest took on structure. Sleep was something we planned around, not assumed. The lake still reflected the sky, still changed color with light and weather. Its beauty didn't disappear. It became incidental. I could appreciate it without trusting it. That distinction mattered. Trust had become selective, earned slowly, withdrawn quickly. We didn't mark the days anymore. Counting implied expectation. Instead, we tracked change. Subtle shifts in sound, patterns of movement, the rhythm of our own responses. Adaptation became the measure of time, not dates. I thought often about the people we'd glimpsed, not with longing or fear, but with recognition. They were navigating the same recalibration shaped by different constraints. Survival wasn't uniform. It was personal, situational, and unevenly distributed. That understanding softened judgment and sharpened caution. What we became wasn't hardened or heroic. We became deliberate. Attention replaced assumption. Observation replaced anticipation. Those shifts didn't make life easier. They made it survivable. The lake house never returned to being a symbol of peace. It also never became a prison. It became context, a place that shaped decisions rather than making them for us. That was its final form. I don't know how long we'll remain here. I don't know what will eventually force movement or invite it. Those questions exist without urgency now. We've learned how to sit with uncertainty without letting it hollow us out. Survival didn't arrive as a dramatic victory. It settled into routine shaped by awareness. What we lost in simplicity, we gained in clarity. The world narrowed, but our understanding deepened. This record isn't proof of success. It's proof of change. We didn't outlast the collapse by escaping it. We adapted inside it. And for now, that has been enough.